Good morning, afternoon, and evening. Welcome to the Global Brief by OneRead.news, where we present you information from all over the globe. Follow us on Insta at global.oneread and help us spread the word by sharing this with everyone you know. Today, we're going to try and connect the dots on a world that just feels like it's spinning faster and faster. We're looking at everything from a heartbreaking strike on a hospital in Gaza to the wild political games being played everywhere from Washington to Buenos Aires. And we're going to end by asking a really big question. What is a modern army even for anymore? So let's try and make sense of it all.
We have to start with a story it's more than just a headline. It's a tragedy built on top of another tragedy. We're in Gaza, a hospital, a place that's supposed to be a sanctuary, a place for healing. It becomes a target. And that term, double tap strike, it is absolutely chilling. It's a tactic where a second strike hits the same spot right after the first one, and it often targets the first responders who are rushing in to help. But when you add that final layer, the journalists were among those killed, the whole story changes. It's not just an attack on people anymore. It's a potential attack on our ability to even know what's really happening on the ground.
And that brings us right into our first section today, flashpoints of conflict and crisis. You can think of these as the spots on the globe where the pressure has just become so intense that something has to break. These are the stories where all that geopolitical tension has a very, very real and immediate human cost.
Okay, let's start with the hard numbers from that Israeli strike on Nasser Hospital in Khan Younis. 21 people killed, 80 wounded. But a number on a screen can feel pretty abstract, so let's really break this down. Of those 21 dead, 5 were confirmed journalists. Now, why does that one detail matter so much? Well, because in any conflict zone, journalists are our eyes and our ears. They work in unbelievably dangerous conditions to get us the raw information, the photos, the interviews, all the stuff that allows the rest of us to form an opinion. When they're killed, it's like a curtain of silence starts to fall. And that creates a vacuum, right? A vacuum that gets filled with propaganda and misinformation. So an attack that kills journalists isn't just ending lives, it's actively making the conflict harder to understand and ultimately harder to ever resolve.
And in that information vacuum, you get exactly what we're seeing here, a full-blown battle of narratives. So on one side, you have Israel's explanation, which is actually kind of two explanations rolled into one. First, they say it was a mishap. Then they say they were targeting a Hamas camera. Now, this combination creates something that analysts call strategic ambiguity. It's a classic move from the playbook. By giving multiple, slightly contradictory reasons, it becomes incredibly difficult to pin down what actually happened or who's responsible. It just fogs up the whole event. And on the other side, the Palestinian Authority's claim is direct, it's unambiguous. They're calling it a war crime. This clash isn't just a simple disagreement, it's a tactic. And history shows us that when these fogs of war are created, real definitive accountability, it rarely ever follows. The story gets lost in the he said, she said, and the push for justice just kind of fades away.
All right, let's shift gears now. We're moving from a sudden, sharp crisis to a slow-burning one that's really testing the limits of human compassion. This number, 1.3 million, that's the number of Rohingya refugees that Bangladesh is currently hosting. Now, to put that into perspective for you, that's like the entire population of Dallas, or maybe Milan, being displaced and living in temporary camps inside your borders. For years, Bangladesh has shouldered this incredible humanitarian weight. They've provided shelter and aid to a people who fled just horrific violence back in their home country of Myanmar. But that generosity, that capacity to help, it's being stretched to its absolute breaking point.
And this quote right here from the interim leader of Bangladesh, Muhammad Yunus, this is the sound of that breaking point. This is not some polite diplomatic request for a little more funding. No, this is a 5-alarmed fire bell being rung on the world stage. When a host nation says it cannot provide more, it's basically a declaration that the system has failed. He's effectively telling the UN, all the NGOs, the wealthy nations of the world, that the current situation is completely unsustainable. The well has run dry. And that poses a terrifyingly practical question. If the host nation, the one that's been doing all the heavy lifting for years, can't cope anymore, what happens to 1.3 million people who have absolutely nowhere else to go? It's a crisis teetering right on the edge of a full-blown catastrophe.
So let's move on to Section 2, the global power and money game. Let's pull our focus back from the front lines of these human crises and look at the grand chessboard. Here, the pieces aren't people. They're things like trade deals, diplomatic visits, and massive aid packages. This is where nations are using their economic and political power as both weapons and shields in this silent, really high-stakes game for global influence.
And you can see that chess game playing out perfectly right here. Look at this. India is making moves on two totally opposite ends of the board, but with the exact same strategic goal in mind. In Algeria, it's sending its army chief to deepen military ties. That's what we call hard power. Meanwhile, over in Fiji, a small but strategically vital island nation in the Pacific, it's signing a defense pact and a whole bunch of other agreements, including things like cricket coaching. That's soft power. So why this big push all of a sudden? Well, the answer in both cases is China. For years, China has been expanding its influence across Africa and the Pacific with its Belt and Road Initiative, building ports, roads, lending money. India is now playing a countergame. It's using its own strengths, military training, cultural connections, its status as the world's largest democracy, to offer these nations an alternative so they don't have to lean too heavily on Beijing.
So while India is playing the strategic game of chess, the US seems to be playing economic hardball. It just slapped a massive 50% tariff on goods coming from both Brazil and India. Now, a tariff is basically just a tax on imports, but a 50% tariff? That's not a negotiation tactic, that's a cannonball. It's designed to make products from those countries so expensive that American consumers will have no choice but to buy American-made stuff instead. It is a very blunt instrument, and it's intended to force these major emerging economies into a corner and protect domestic industries. The real question is, how do they respond?
And the responses are fascinating because they are so different, but they tell the exact same story. Neither country is backing down. Brazil is going for a more cultural, nationalistic response. They're launching a public campaign to encourage their citizens to buy Brazilian products, like acai and nuts. It's a rally around the flag kind of economic defense. India, on the other hand, is taking a more technical, top-down approach. Its central bank is stepping in, using its financial muscle to absorb the shock and stabilize its currency. So what's the big takeaway here? It's that in the face of US economic pressure, these major economies are no longer just accepting the terms, they're choosing to stand on their own, whether it's through national pride or financial engineering, rather than bow to a deal they see as unfair. It's a huge sign of a fracturing global economic order.
But money isn't always used as a weapon, right? Sometimes it's used as a shield. The European Union is sending 500 million euros in an aid package to Jordan. Now, on the surface, this might look like charity, but believe me, it is far more strategic than that. This is what you would call geopolitical finance. Just look at where Jordan is on a map. It's this pocket of relative stability bordering the chaos of Syria, Iraq, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For the EU, that 500 million euros isn't just an investment in Jordan's economy, it's an investment in a firewall. It's a calculated move to prop up a crucial buffer state, hoping to contain all that regional instability and prevent it from spilling over and creating yet another refugee crisis on Europe's doorstep.
This reveals such a fascinating dynamic inside the US government. While the White House is swinging the big hammer of tariffs, another part of the government, the Congress, is flying all over the world doing damage control. You've got a delegation of senators visiting key allies like Japan and South Korea, and their job is basically to say, hey, we know those economic policies are rattling you, but please don't lose faith in us. It's a classic good cop, bad cop routine playing out on the world stage. It's such an important reminder that a country's foreign policy is rarely a single unified strategy. It's often a messy push and pull between different power centers with totally different priorities, and sometimes they're even working against each other.
Okay, Section 3, High-Stakes Domestic Politics. So now we turn from the global chessboard to the battles happening within nations. And these internal power struggles can feel purely local, but their consequences can ripple outwards, affecting everything from international alliances to the entire global economy. This is where we look at how a nation's own identity and its future are really being fought over.
And first up, the United States, with a move that perfectly captures this question. President Trump has signed an executive order aiming to prosecute people who burn the American flag. But here's the catch. The Supreme Court has already ruled, multiple times, that flag burning is a form of free speech protected by the Constitution. So what's really going on here? This isn't about creating a law that's going to stick, it's what we call political theater. The goal isn't legal, it's cultural. The order is designed to energize his political base, to dominate the news cycle, and to force a national debate about patriotism and protest, but on his terms. The legal impact is likely going to be zero, but the political impact, well, that's the entire point of the exercise.
So, from political theater, we move to political reality, with absolutely life-or-death stakes over in France. Prime Minister François Bayrou is facing a confidence vote. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, a confidence vote is basically a high-stakes challenge where the parliament gets to vote on whether they still have faith in the current government. If the prime minister loses this, the government collapses, which could force a snap election. And the reason for the vote? Deeply unpopular budget cuts.
Opposition parties from both the far left and the far right see a moment of weakness and they're uniting to try and topple him. This isn't just some policy debate, this is a political knife fight that could plunge one of Europe's core countries into immense instability.
Over in Cambodia, we're seeing a situation where the law itself is being sharpened into a weapon against political opponents. The government there has passed a new law that allows it to revoke a person's citizenship. Now, human rights groups are screaming about this, and here's why. The law is written with incredibly vague language, and a vaguely worded law in the hands of an authoritarian government is like giving them a blank check for abuse. It creates a kind of legal trapdoor. It could be used to target journalists, activists, or political rivals, stripping them not just of their passport, but of their most fundamental right to belong to a country. It effectively makes them stateless and powerless to fight back.
Let's talk about political kryptonite for a second. In Argentina, President Javier Milei came to power like a whirlwind, promising to take a chainsaw to the corrupt political establishment. His entire political brand was built on being the outsider who would finally clean house. But now, his own sister, who is also one of his top aides, is being investigated in a corruption probe involving kickbacks. For most politicians, this would be a major scandal. But for a government whose entire identity is based on being anti-corruption, it's potentially an existential threat. Even just the perception of hypocrisy can cripple their ability to govern and destroy the very foundation of their support.
And staying in South America, this story coming out of Bolivia captures a pattern we have seen again and again and again in the region's history. A leading presidential candidate is proposing a radical shift in economic policy. Privatize state-owned companies, slash taxes for corporations, and go to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, for a bailout. This is the textbook definition of neoliberal free market economics. For decades, the political mood in Latin America has swung back and forth like a pendulum, from left-leaning leaders who favor state control over resources and big social programs, to right-leaning leaders who favor free markets and attracting foreign investment. Well, this is the pendulum swinging hard in the other direction once again. Finally, let's head over to New Zealand for a debate about the fundamental mechanics of democracy itself. They're thinking about holding a referendum to change their parliamentary term from 3 years to 4, and this sparks a timeless debate. On one side, the argument for a 3-year term is all about accountability. It forces politicians to constantly face the voters, meaning they can't get too comfortable or just ignore public opinion. On the other side, the argument for a 4-year term is all about stability. It gives a government more breathing room to plan and execute long-term policies without being in a permanent state of campaigning. You know, there is no easy answer here. It's a fundamental trade-off that every single democracy has to grapple with. And for our final section, a world reshaping itself. Here, we're going to zoom out one last time to look at how the fundamental systems that underpin our world are being forced to change. From criminal justice to our response to climate change, the old playbooks are being thrown out as societies try to adapt to completely new realities.
Let's start with a concept from Greek mythology that perfectly explains a massive modern problem. Ismail El Mayo Zambada, the legendary leader of the Sinaloa cartel, has pleaded guilty in a U.S. court. Now this feels like a monumental victory, right? The end of an era. But this is where the Hydra effect comes in. In the myth, when the hero Hercules cuts off one head of the monster Hydra, 2 more grow back in its place. Well, the modern global drug trade operates exactly like this. Taking out one kingpin, even one as powerful as El Mayo, it doesn't kill the organization. The networks are now so decentralized and so fluid that new leaders, new trafficking routes, and new methods just pop up to fill the void. You've cut off a head, but the monster itself, it adapts and it lives on.
So if the Hydra effect is the problem, how do you even begin to fight it? Well, China is trying a new tactic in its fight against money laundering. For years, the strategy was to just arrest as many low-level players as possible, the so-called money mules who physically move the cash around. But they realized this was like trimming the leaves off a weed. It never actually killed the root. So they're making a strategic shift. Now the focus is on targeting the masterminds, the architects of these criminal networks. And to do that, they're showing leniency to the mules, trying to flip them and get them to cooperate and lead them up the chain. It's a fascinating attempt to stop just cutting off the Hydra's heads and instead try to find and destroy its heart.
Let's move to a different system that's being reshaped, the very job of governing. Right now, Typhoon Kajiki is battering Vietnam. The immediate story is, of course, the damage and the danger to people. But the bigger, more profound story is that the mass evacuations and emergency responses, they're not a surprise anymore. For climate-vulnerable nations like Vietnam, these powerful storms are shifting from being once-in-a-generation disasters to becoming a routine, predictable part of the annual calendar. And this means climate change is moving off the emergency budget line and onto the annual operating expenses line. It forces a complete rethinking of infrastructure, city planning, and national budgets. It is a costly and terrifying new normal.
And we end today with a question that goes right to the very heart of national identity. The Australian Army is hosting a major symposium, but it's not about new tanks or battlefield tactics. The topic is its role in society. See, in a world where the biggest threats aren't always another army, but can be a cyber attack, a pandemic, a flood, or rampant disinformation, what is a military for? Their role is visibly expanding. They're called in for disaster relief after floods and fires. They're involved in cybersecurity. They're helping with public health crises. This conversation happening in Australia is a sign that modern militaries everywhere are grappling with a fundamental identity crisis. How do you evolve from being just a fighting force into a multi-tool for national resilience in the 21st century?
And that's our look at the world for today. We hope we've helped connect a few of the dots for you. Our goal is never to tell you what to think, but to give you the unbiased facts so you can form your own conclusions. Thank you for your support. Follow us on Spotify and YouTube to listen to this podcast every morning at 8 a.m. GMT.